The acrid smell of rocket fuel burned through the underground corridors of the Mittelwerk factory as engineer Klaus Richter made the decision that would haunt Adolf Hitler's final years. It was March 8, 1944, deep beneath the Harz Mountains, and Richter's trembling fingers hovered over the guidance system calculations that would determine whether the next volley of Vergeltungswaffe 2 rockets would find their targets in London or scatter harmlessly into the English countryside. Around him, the ghostly figures of emaciated slave laborers shuffled past, their hollow eyes reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights that never dimmed in this subterranean hell. Richter had spent months perfecting these guidance systems, but tonight, as he stared at the mathematics of death spread across his desk, he made a choice that would transform him from Hitler's rocket engineer into the Führer's most terrifying nightmare. He reached for his pencil and began to alter the calculations, introducing subtle errors that would make Germany's most advanced weapon as unreliable as a compass in a magnetic storm. No one in the Third Reich knew that one man's quiet rebellion in the depths of a mountain would soon reveal just how fragile Hitler's wonder weapons really were. Klaus Richter had never intended to become a saboteur. Born in the small Bavarian town of Rosenheim in 1914, he was the son of a mathematics professor and a piano teacher, raised in a household where precision and beauty were considered the highest virtues. His childhood was spent building model airplanes in his father's workshop and solving complex equations at the kitchen table, while his mother practiced Chopin in the adjoining room. The boy who would one day hold Hitler's most secret weapon in his hands grew up believing that engineering was a form of art, that mathematics could unlock the mysteries of the universe, and that human ingenuity could solve any problem if applied with sufficient skill and dedication. When he graduated from the Technical University of Munich in 1936 with a degree in aerospace engineering, young Richter possessed an almost naive faith in the power of science to improve the human condition. He had written his thesis on rocket propulsion systems, fascinated by the theoretical possibility of reaching the edge of space, and his professors had praised his intuitive understanding of guidance systems and trajectory calculations. The 22-year-old engineer who accepted a position with the German rocket development program at Peenemünde believed he was joining a noble quest to push the boundaries of human knowledge and perhaps one day reach the stars. He had no idea that his mathematical genius would soon be harnessed to rain death from the sky, or that his conscience would eventually force him to choose between loyalty to his country and loyalty to his soul. Richter's arrival at the Peenemünde research facility on the Baltic coast in October 1936 marked the beginning of what he initially believed would be the most exciting period of his life. The sprawling complex of laboratories and test stands represented the cutting edge of rocket technology, where brilliant minds like Wernher von Braun were attempting to turn science fiction into reality. Richter was assigned to the Guidance Systems Division, where his job was to solve the incredibly complex problem of making a rocket find its target across hundreds of miles with accuracy measured in city blocks rather than continents. The work was intellectually stimulating beyond anything he had experienced in university, requiring him to integrate principles of physics, mathematics, and engineering in ways that pushed the absolute limits of contemporary knowledge. His colleagues were some of the brightest scientific minds in Europe, and their conversations ranged from the theoretical physics of orbital mechanics to the practical challenges of building gyroscopes precise enough to guide a missile through the upper atmosphere. For nearly 3 years, Richter threw himself into his work with the enthusiasm of a man who believed he was participating in humanity's greatest adventure, developing guidance systems that could theoretically place a rocket within a few hundred yards of any target on Earth. His innovative approaches to trajectory calculation earned him recognition from von Braun himself, and by 1939, the young engineer had become one of the most valued members of the guidance team. He had no way of knowing that the theoretical weapons he was perfecting with such care would soon be aimed at civilians, or that his mathematical elegance would be employed in the service of a war that would consume the world. The transformation of the Peenemünde rocket program from scientific research to military weapon development began in earnest when Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, but the full horror of what Richter was helping to create did not become clear to him until much later. Initially, the military applications seemed almost abstract, mathematical problems divorced from their real-world consequences. The rockets being developed were still experimental, their targets theoretical points on maps rather than actual cities filled with actual people. Richter continued to refine his guidance systems with the same intellectual passion he had always brought to complex engineering challenges, focusing on the technical elegance of his solutions rather than their ultimate purpose. The breakthrough that would make the Vergeltungswaffe II rocket a practical weapon came in early 1942, when Richter's team successfully developed a guidance system accurate enough to hit targets the size of London from launch sites in occupied France. The mathematical achievement represented years of painstaking work, requiring innovations in gyroscope technology, trajectory calculation, and automated control systems that pushed German engineering to its absolute limits. When the first successful test launch sent a rocket 200 miles downrange to impact within 500 yards of its intended target, the assembled scientists and military officials erupted in celebration. Richter remembered feeling a surge of professional pride at seeing his calculations translated into mechanical reality, watching his mathematics guide a ton of metal and explosives through a perfect parabolic arc to its distant target. But even as he accepted congratulations from his colleagues and superiors, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that he had just helped create something that would bring death to thousands of innocent people. He pushed that voice aside, telling himself that he was a scientist, not a soldier, and that the moral implications of his work were beyond his responsibility as an engineer. The first crack in Richter's faith appeared in June 1943, when the rocket program was dramatically expanded and moved to a new underground production facility carved out of the Harz Mountains. The Mittelwerk factory represented the largest underground manufacturing complex in the world, a vast network of tunnels and chambers where the Vergeltungswaffe II rockets would be mass-produced using slave labor from nearby concentration camps. Richter's new assignment was to oversee the installation and calibration of guidance systems for rockets that would soon be raining down on London, Antwerp, and other Allied cities. The engineer who had once dreamed of reaching the stars found himself working in artificial caverns lit by harsh electric bulbs, surrounded by the constant sound of machinery and the shuffle of prisoners who built the weapons that would carry his calculations to their targets. The workers were Polish prisoners of war, French resistance fighters, Russian civilians, and concentration camp inmates, all laboring under conditions that shocked even Richter's previously sheltered sensibilities. They worked 12-hour shifts with minimal food and no medical care, sleeping in overcrowded barracks that were little more than human warehouses. Many died from exhaustion, malnutrition, or the casual brutality of their guards, and their bodies were simply replaced by new prisoners shipped in from camps across occupied Europe. Richter watched in growing horror as his elegant mathematical theories were implemented by the hands of dying slaves, and for the first time he began to understand the true cost of the weapon he had helped to perfect. The guidance systems he had developed with such care were being installed by men who would likely be dead within months, and the rockets they built would carry his calculations to targets where other innocent people would die in explosions calculated with mathematical precision. The moral awakening that would transform Klaus Richter from engineer to saboteur began with a single conversation in October 1943, when he witnessed a dying French prisoner trying to explain the principles of gyroscope stabilization to a newly arrived group of workers. The man was clearly educated, probably an engineer or scientist himself before his capture, and he was using his last reserves of strength to ensure that the guidance systems would be installed correctly. Richter realized with a shock that this prisoner understood the technology as well as he did, and that the man was essentially training his own replacements in the construction of weapons that would kill his countrymen. When Richter approached the prisoner after the shift ended, speaking to him in French he had learned in university, he discovered that Henri Dubois had been a professor of mechanical engineering at the University of Lyon before his arrest for resistance activities. The conversation that followed in the shadows of the underground factory changed everything for the German engineer. As Dubois explained with calm precision exactly what Richter's guidance systems would accomplish when mounted in rockets launched against civilian targets. The French professor described the mathematics of destruction in terms that stripped away all of Richter's comfortable abstractions, calculating the probable casualties per rocket, the optimal targeting strategies for maximum civilian impact, and the psychological effect of precision weapons against undefended cities. By the time their conversation ended, Richter understood that his guidance systems would not be used against military targets or strategic installations, but against apartment buildings, hospitals, schools, and churches, filled with people whose only crime was living in cities opposed to Hitler's war. Professor Dubois died 3 days later, but his words continued to echo in Richter's mind as he watched new prisoners arrive to take his place and continue building rockets that would carry German engineering precision into the heart of enemy cities. The decision to begin sabotaging his own work did not come easily to Klaus Richter, and it evolved gradually over the winter months of 1943 and 1944 as he struggled with the implications of his situation. Initially, he told himself that he could simply request a transfer to another project, perhaps something related to aircraft engines or submarine technology, that would remove him from direct involvement in the rocket program. But he quickly realized that his expertise in guidance systems made him too valuable to release, and that any attempt to withdraw from the project would likely result in his immediate arrest and execution as a traitor. More importantly, he came to understand that someone else would simply take his place, and that the guidance systems would continue to improve without his sabotage to limit their effectiveness. The engineer who had once believed that scientific knowledge was morally neutral began to see that in the context of total war, every technical achievement was a weapon that would be used to kill someone, and that his choice was not between good and evil, but between different forms of complicity. If he continued to perfect his guidance systems, he would be directly responsible for the deaths of thousands of Allied civilians. If he began to sabotage his own work, he might save some of those lives while risking his own in an act of resistance that could cost him everything. The mathematics of the moral equation were as clear as any engineering problem he had ever solved, but the emotional cost of reaching the obvious conclusion nearly broke him. For weeks, he lay awake in his quarters, staring at the ceiling and calculating the probable results of action versus inaction, trying to find some third option that would allow him to maintain his integrity without betraying his country or his conscience. The first act of sabotage was so subtle that even Richter himself was not entirely certain it was intentional. In February 1944, while reviewing guidance system calculations for a new batch of rockets, he noticed a small error in the gyroscope calibration specifications that would cause the rockets to drift slightly off course during their flight phase. The error was within the margin that could be attributed to normal engineering tolerances, but Richter knew that the cumulative effect would be to scatter the rockets across a much wider area than intended, reducing their accuracy from city blocks to entire neighborhoods. Instead of correcting the error, he allowed it to stand, telling himself that it might have been an honest mistake that simply escaped his notice. 2 weeks later, when British intelligence reports filtered back through captured German communications, Richter learned that the first rockets launched with his modified guidance systems had indeed scattered across a much wider area than expected, with several falling in unpopulated areas outside London rather than in the densely packed residential districts they had been intended to target. The knowledge that his small deception had probably saved dozens of lives gave him the courage to begin making more systematic changes to the guidance calculations, introducing subtle errors that would degrade accuracy without being obvious enough to trigger suspicion from the quality control inspectors. Over the next several months, Richter developed an increasingly sophisticated system of sabotage, using his intimate knowledge of guidance systems to introduce failures that would appear to be random equipment problems rather than deliberate sabotage. By the spring of 1944, Klaus Richter had become the most effective saboteur in the German rocket program, systematically degrading the accuracy of guidance systems while maintaining his reputation as one of the program's most dedicated engineers. His methods were elegantly simple and virtually undetectable, relying on his authority as the chief guidance engineer to approve calculations that contained subtle but critical errors. He would introduce microscopic tolerances into gyroscope specifications that would cause drift over long distances, approve software routines that contain timing errors too small to detect in testing but large enough to affect accuracy over hundreds of miles, and modify trajectory calculations to account for atmospheric conditions that did not actually exist at the altitudes the rockets would reach. The cumulative effect of these changes was to transform the Vergeltungswaffe 2 from a precision weapon capable of hitting specific buildings into something closer to a very expensive artillery shell that might land anywhere within a several-mile radius of its intended target. British civilian casualties from rocket attacks dropped dramatically during this period, not because fewer rockets were being launched, but because those rockets were far more likely to fall in empty fields, rivers, or industrial areas, rather than in the residential neighborhoods they were supposed to target. Richter's sabotage was so effective that German intelligence analysts began to suspect that British scientists had developed some form of electronic countermeasure that was interfering with rocket guidance systems, leading to extensive investigations into possible Allied jamming technologies that consumed valuable resources while missing the real source of the guidance failures. The irony was not lost on Richter that his sabotage was so successful that it was actually credited to British technical superiority rather than German incompetence. The scope of Richter's resistance activities expanded beyond sabotage in the summer of 1944, when he was approached by a representative of the French resistance who had infiltrated the Mittelwerk factory as a prisoner laborer. The contact was made through a complex system of coded communications that took advantage of Richter's position as a supervisor who regularly inspected production areas where prisoners worked, allowing him to pass information without arousing suspicion from the guards or security personnel. The resistance contact, who identified himself only as Marcel, explained that the Allies were desperately in need of detailed technical information about rocket guidance systems, launch procedures, and production capabilities that could help them develop countermeasures and predict German attack patterns. Richter's unique position gave him access to information that no other Allied agent could possibly obtain, including production schedules, technical specifications, and strategic targeting plans that were classified at the highest levels of the German command structure. The decision to begin passing intelligence to the Allies represented an enormous escalation in the level of risk Richter was willing to accept, but he had come to believe that sabotage alone was not sufficient to prevent the mass casualties that improved guidance systems would eventually cause. Over the next several months, he developed an elaborate system for copying and transmitting classified documents, using his access to the engineering offices to photograph technical drawings, production schedules, and targeting plans that he then passed to resistance contacts through a network of prisoner laborers who had been recruited as couriers. The intelligence information that Klaus Richter provided to the Allied forces through the resistance network proved to be absolutely crucial in developing effective countermeasures against the Vergeltungswaffe 2 rocket attacks that began in earnest in September 1944. His detailed technical specifications allowed British scientists to understand exactly how the guidance systems worked, enabling them to develop jamming technologies and tracking systems that could predict rocket trajectories and provide advance warning to civilian populations. More importantly, his copies of German targeting plans allowed Allied military commanders to anticipate attack patterns and evacuate or reinforce likely targets before rockets could reach them. The production schedules he smuggled out enabled Allied bombers to time their attacks on rocket manufacturing facilities to achieve maximum disruption of the supply chain, while his intelligence about launch site locations allowed for precision strikes against mobile launchers that were extremely difficult to locate without inside information. Perhaps most significantly, Richter's reports on the morale and conditions inside the Mittelwerk factory provided Allied intelligence with crucial information about the sustainability of German rocket production, revealing that the program was consuming enormous resources while producing relatively few operational weapons. The combination of sabotage and intelligence gathering that Richter orchestrated probably saved thousands of Allied civilian lives while contributing significantly to the eventual collapse of the German rocket program as an effective strategic weapon. But the very success of his resistance activities also made his eventual discovery almost inevitable, as German security forces began to notice patterns in guidance system failures that suggested deliberate sabotage rather than random equipment problems. The beginning of the end for Richter's sabotage operation came in November 1944, when a routine security investigation into production delays at the Mittelwerk factory uncovered evidence of systematic intelligence-gathering activities among the prisoner labor force. The investigation was triggered by reports from informants among the prisoners who had noticed unusual communication patterns and document handling that suggested organized resistance activities within the factory complex. German security forces, led by Oberführer Heinrich Kammler of the SS, launched a comprehensive investigation that combined traditional interrogation techniques with advanced surveillance methods designed to identify the source of intelligence leaks that were clearly occurring at the highest levels of the rocket program. The investigation focused initially on prisoner laborers and low-level supervisors, but the sophisticated nature of the intelligence being gathered soon convinced investigators that the operation required access to classified technical documents and production schedules that were only available to senior engineering personnel. Richter's position as chief guidance engineer made him an obvious suspect, but his reputation for loyalty and his technical contributions to the program initially protected him from suspicion. However, when security investigators began comparing dates of guidance system failures with dates when classified documents had been accessed, patterns emerged that pointed unmistakably toward the Guidance Engineering Division as the source of both sabotage and intelligence leaks. The discovery that would ultimately expose Klaus Richter's resistance activities came from an unexpected source in December 1944, when a dying French prisoner named Henri Dubois was found to have hidden a detailed technical diagram of rocket guidance systems in his clothing. The diagram was far too sophisticated to have been drawn by someone without extensive engineering knowledge, and the level of detail suggested that it had been copied from classified German documents, rather than reconstructed from memory or observation. When investigators compared the diagram to official technical drawings, they realized that it was an exact copy of specifications that had been updated only weeks earlier, meaning that someone with current access to classified documents was systematically copying and distributing them. The investigation that followed was swift and brutal, as security forces arrested and interrogated every person who had access to the specific documents that had been copied, using techniques that quickly revealed the extent of the resistance network operating within the factory. Under torture, several prisoners revealed that they had received documents from a German engineer who spoke fluent French and had been providing intelligence to the resistance for months. When investigators realized that Richter was the only senior engineer who spoke French and had regular contact with French prisoners, his fate was essentially sealed. The security forces began surveillance of his activities while preparing to arrest him for treason, but their investigation was complicated by the fact that Richter's sabotage had been so subtle that it was difficult to prove deliberate intent rather than honest engineering errors. The moment that would reveal the full scope of Klaus Richter's resistance activities and simultaneously terrify Adolf Hitler himself came on January 15, 1945, when Richter was arrested during a routine document inspection that had been secretly arranged as part of the ongoing security investigation. In his possession, investigators found copies of the most highly classified technical specifications for advanced guidance systems that were still in development, along with production schedules for rocket manufacturing that extended into the spring of 1945. More damning still, they discovered coded notes that revealed the sophisticated mathematical techniques he had been using to introduce errors into guidance calculations, providing proof that months of guidance system failures had been the result of deliberate sabotage rather than technical incompetence. When confronted with this evidence, Richter made a decision that would have consequences far beyond his own fate. Instead of denying his activities or attempting to minimize their scope, he provided investigators with a complete confession that detailed every aspect of his sabotage and intelligence-gathering operations, including the names of resistance contacts, the methods used to copy and transmit documents, and the specific technical changes he had made to degrade rocket accuracy. His confession revealed that a single German engineer had systematically compromised Germany's most advanced weapon system for nearly a year, raising terrifying questions about the security of other critical military programs and the loyalty of other technical personnel who had access to classified information. When Hitler received reports of Richter's confession in the final bunker beneath Berlin, the Führer's reaction was immediate and explosive, revealing a level of paranoia and terror that surprised even his most senior advisors. The discovery that his most advanced weapon had been systematically sabotaged by one of its own engineers shattered Hitler's faith in the loyalty and reliability of the scientific and technical personnel who were developing the wonder weapons he believed would turn the tide of the war. More terrifying to Hitler than the immediate implications of Richter's sabotage was the realization that if one engineer could compromise an entire weapon system, then any of the thousands of scientists and engineers working on rocket development, jet aircraft, nuclear research, and other advanced military technologies could be doing the same thing. The thought that his most secret and advanced military programs might be riddled with saboteurs and spies sent Hitler into rages that lasted for days as he demanded immediate investigations into the loyalty of every technical person with access to classified military research. His paranoia reached such levels that he began to suspect that German technical failures in other areas might also be the result of sabotage rather than Allied technical superiority, leading him to order purges and investigations that consumed valuable resources while undermining the morale and effectiveness of the remaining research programs. The man who had pinned his hopes for victory on technological solutions suddenly found himself unable to trust the very people who were supposed to deliver those solutions, creating a paralyzing crisis of confidence that affected decision-making at the highest levels of the German government. The ripple effects of Hitler's terror at the discovery of Richter's sabotage extended far beyond the immediate investigation into the rocket program, ultimately contributing to the collapse of German scientific and technical research efforts in the final months of the war. Hitler's demands for loyalty investigations and security clearances created an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that made it almost impossible for scientists and engineers to collaborate effectively on complex technical projects that required the free exchange of information and ideas. Many of Germany's most brilliant technical minds began to focus more on protecting themselves from accusations of disloyalty than on developing the advanced weapons that were supposed to save the Third Reich from defeat. The rocket program itself was essentially paralyzed for months while investigators attempted to determine the full extent of sabotage activities and rebuild guidance systems from scratch using personnel whose loyalty had been verified through extensive background checks. Similar investigations were launched into jet aircraft development, nuclear research, submarine technology, and other advanced military programs, consuming resources and delaying development schedules that were already under enormous pressure from material shortages and Allied bombing attacks. The irony was that Richter's sabotage had achieved something that direct Allied attacks on German research facilities had been unable to accomplish. It had introduced a level of paranoia and mistrust that made effective scientific research almost impossible to continue. Klaus Richter himself paid the ultimate price for his resistance activities when he was executed by firing squad on March 2, 1945, but not before being subjected to months of interrogation designed to extract every detail of his sabotage methods and resistance contacts. His execution was kept secret from all but the highest levels of the German command structure, as Hitler feared that publicity about the case would further undermine confidence in German technical capabilities and inspire other potential saboteurs to follow Richter's example. The engineer who had once dreamed of reaching the stars died in an underground prison cell, but his sacrifice had achieved something that even he might not have anticipated. It had planted seeds of doubt and fear in Hitler's mind that would grow into a paralyzing paranoia about the loyalty of Germany's scientific and technical personnel. The guidance systems that Richter had spent months sabotaging were eventually rebuilt and improved, but the delays caused by security investigations and the atmosphere of suspicion that his activities created meant that improved Vergeltungswaffe 2 rockets never achieved the level of effectiveness that German military planners had expected. More significantly, The resources and personnel devoted to investigating and preventing further sabotage were resources that could not be used for actual weapon development, creating a hidden cost to Hitler's wonder weapon programs that may have been more damaging than the sabotage itself. In the decades following the war, intelligence analysts and military historians gradually came to understand the full scope of Klaus Richter's impact on the German rocket program and its psychological effect on Hitler's decision-making during the final months of the Third Reich. Documents recovered from German archives revealed that Hitler's paranoia about technical sabotage had influenced his decisions about resource allocation, personnel assignments, and strategic planning in ways that significantly hampered the German war effort during its most critical period. The Führer's loss of confidence in his scientific and technical personnel had contributed to delays in multiple weapons development programs, while his demands for security investigations had diverted intelligence resources away from more productive activities like monitoring Allied technical developments and protecting German research facilities from bombing attacks. Perhaps most importantly, Hitler's terror at the discovery that his own engineers could not be trusted had reinforced his tendency to micromanage technical decisions that were beyond his understanding, leading to increasingly irrational commands that further degraded the effectiveness of German research and development efforts. The engineer who had started the war believing that scientific knowledge was morally neutral had ended it by demonstrating that individual conscience and courage could undermine even the most totalitarian system when applied with sufficient intelligence and determination. The broader implications of Richter's resistance activities extended far beyond their immediate impact on German rocket development, providing a model for technical sabotage and intelligence gathering that would influence resistance movements and intelligence operations for decades to come. His methods for introducing subtle but critical errors into complex technical systems demonstrated that a single individual with sufficient knowledge and access could compromise even the most sophisticated military technologies without detection for extended periods. More importantly, his decision to combine sabotage with intelligence gathering showed how technical personnel could leverage their unique access to classified information to provide crucial support to their country's enemies while maintaining their cover as loyal employees. The psychological impact of his activities on Hitler and the German command structure illustrated how individual acts of resistance could have effects far beyond their immediate tactical consequences, creating doubt and paranoia that undermined the effectiveness of entire organizations. Intelligence agencies around the world studied Richter's case as an example of how technical professionals could be recruited and utilized as resistance assets, while security organizations developed new procedures for monitoring and controlling access to classified technical information that reflected lessons learned from his successful infiltration of one of Germany's most secret weapons programs. The legacy of Klaus Richter's courage and sacrifice became clearer in the post-war period, when Allied intelligence agencies were finally able to assess the full impact of his sabotage and intelligence activities on the German rocket program and the broader war effort. Analysis of captured German documents revealed that his modifications to guidance systems had reduced the accuracy of Vergeltungswaffe II rockets by approximately 40% during the period of his sabotage, probably saving hundreds of Allied civilian lives while undermining German confidence in their most advanced strategic weapon. His intelligence reports had enabled the development of countermeasures and defensive preparations that further reduced the effectiveness of rocket attacks, while his information about production capabilities and launch procedures had allowed Allied forces to optimize their own attacks on German rocket facilities. Perhaps most significantly, his activities had created a crisis of confidence within the German technical community that lasted well beyond his own execution, contributing to the collapse of multiple advanced weapons programs that might otherwise have reached operational status before the war ended. The engineer who had been executed as a traitor by his own government was posthumously recognized by Allied intelligence as one of the most effective resistance operatives of the entire war, whose individual actions had achieved strategic impacts typically associated with entire intelligence networks or military units. When the full story of Klaus Richter's resistance activities finally became known to the public decades after the war, his example inspired a new understanding of the moral responsibilities of technical professionals working on military projects, and the potential for individual conscience to influence the course of major historical events. His transformation from loyal engineer to saboteur illustrated the complex moral calculations that scientists and engineers must make when their professional skills are employed for purposes they find morally objectionable, while his methods demonstrated that even the most sophisticated technical systems are vulnerable to insider threats when motivated by principle rather than personal gain. The fact that his activities had terrified Hitler himself provided a powerful example of how individual resistance could undermine totalitarian systems from within, creating doubt and paranoia that were often more damaging than direct military attacks. Educational programs for engineering students and technical professionals began to use Richter's case as an example of the importance of maintaining individual moral judgment even within hierarchical organizations, while intelligence and security agencies studied his methods as an illustration of both the potential effectiveness and the inherent risks of insider resistance operations. The dark reason that the Vergeltungswaffe 2 rocket terrified Hitler himself was not its potential for destruction, but its demonstration of how vulnerable his most advanced weapons were to the conscience of a single individual who possessed the knowledge and courage to act according to his principles rather than his orders. Klaus Richter's decision to sabotage his own work and provide intelligence to his country's enemies revealed a fundamental weakness in totalitarian systems that rely on technical expertise. They cannot function without the cooperation of skilled professionals, who must ultimately choose between loyalty to the system and loyalty to their own moral convictions. Hitler's terror at discovering Richter's activities reflected his sudden understanding that every scientist and engineer working on Germany's wonder weapons possessed the same power to undermine those weapons through individual acts of resistance that were virtually impossible to detect or prevent. The psychological impact of this realization on Hitler and his inner circle demonstrated that individual courage could achieve strategic effects by creating doubt and paranoia that were far more damaging than the immediate tactical consequences of any specific act of sabotage. The engineer who had dreamed of reaching the stars had instead reached something far more important. He had proven that totalitarian power, no matter how comprehensive and brutal, ultimately depended on the voluntary cooperation of individuals who retained the freedom to choose conscience over compliance. In the end, the most terrifying thing about the Vergeltungswaffe 2 rocket was not what it could do to Hitler's enemies, but what one man's resistance had revealed about the fragility of Hitler's own power. Would you have possessed the courage to sabotage your own work and risk everything to save the lives of strangers? Comment below and share this story so others can remember that individual conscience applied with intelligence and determination remains one of the most powerful weapons against tyranny and oppression.